we sat down and thought through what is the end goal of decentralization, as in what purpose does it serve for the user? Because everything should be delivering value. And I think sometimes technologists get a bit hung up on technology for technology's sake. But then when it meets the real world, you have problems scaling, users have problems using it. And it's hard to get the real world to bend to fit this perfect idea of a system. Instead, we tried to start from human-centered design, which is what do people want? Why are they dissatisfied with social? What is going to make them want an open alternative? Because we think it's good that you have openness and control, but sometimes people would rather just have convenience with all of its attendant ills than have
Simplicity.
To fuss with their keys, right. And so we thought about the key things you want out of decentralization are choice and customizability, because when developers can build, you have all these options. And you want the ability to exit if somebody does something that you don't like. So you might be happy using a service in a totally centralized way up until someday they do something that you really don't like and you want to migrate. But that threshold for you migrating has to be really, really high right now, because you have to get a new identity. You have to rebuild your social graph. You have to port all your data over, or maybe you can't port it over. So it's just starting over from scratch. But if you can port things more easily and you have this right to leave and vote with your feet, then you can move around. And so it's more like choosing jurisdictions. So the way that we describe the sort of ethos of atproto and the way we built Bluesky is a federated republic. So you have these different services that can run on this network, and there is some centralized governance to it, centralized moderation to it, but you can choose other jurisdictions, both within the app by stacking other moderation services on it, or outside of the app, because you can move around, choose another service provider. Now, how easy is this to do over time? How many are there? These are questions about an evolving ecosystem, but structurally, that's the philosophy of it.
Welcome back to the Slow Hunch podcast. This week is a special treat. We're joined by Jay Graber, who is the founder of the Bluesky social network and the protocol, which is the protocol underlying the network. Jay and I get into her story of how she first started thinking about systems, decentralized and otherwise, and media and the importance of the shape of them, how they're perceived and used, and why they might matter to us in different ways. Amazing conversation. I hope you enjoy. Well, Jay Graber, welcome to the Slow Hunch podcast. It's a real pleasure to see you. Bluesky has gotten a lot of attention as a growing network, and there are also a lot of aspects of its architecture and its design and its concept that are maybe not the thing people may pay the most attention to. Maybe it makes sense for you to just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about how you got here.
Yeah, let's see. So I'm CEO of Bluesky now. I started off with the Bluesky project as an external contributor. So as a decentralized social expert working on systems in and around decentralized social media, doing research and writing and programming. And I started off my career as a digital rights activist.
You and I actually got to know each other in the context of your work on decentralized protocols when you were at Zcash. I actually think it makes a ton of sense that you have a background in digital rights activism. There's a lot of politics embedded in our technology. Maybe going back to the early days, what got you interested in this gnarly basket of concepts?
Yeah, well, it started pretty early because in college, I studied science, technology, and society. So this is a pretty small major that I didn't know existed at first. But as soon as I found it, I gravitated towards it because my dad was a math and science teacher growing up, middle school, high school. But he had me read a lot of these history of science, history of math books. And so I got interested in how science is a social process. And it happens in the context of a society, in the context of the people who do it, and technology as well. Everything kind of evolves together with the people building it. And so when I found STSC, it was this major that was essentially sociology and history of science. It let me go deep on those things. So I ended up designing my own independent study. I kind of had two theses because I couldn't pick. So one of them was around the extended mind and how our technology is an extension of ourselves and our cognitive processes.
Wow.
And then the other one was around virtual currencies, which included Bitcoin, but also covered things like local currencies, time banks. I started a time bank on campus, which was a way to, exchange an hour of your time for an hour of your friend's time and have a network where you can kind of have this reciprocal exchange going around. So that was all really fun. And I was thinking a lot about these things, but that was also the era of Occupy and Edward Snowden and Julian Assange and all this sort of new controversy around what the internet was and what it was becoming. And I really remember this little social network called Diaspora getting funded by a Kickstarter back then. And I think, like a lot of people, it hadn't occurred to me that things could be different than one company running everything, or, users just having to opt into what the companies gave you. But I was at that transition point where I remembered having a Zanga before Facebook. And so I liked being able to customize my page and just kind of accepted it when we transitioned onto Facebook, but was starting to get frustrated with it like later on. And so seeing something like Diaspora come along that gave you a bit more control, you had these pods, it was this federated system. It was really exciting to me. And so I ended up working in digital rights policy after college. I worked at some local media nonprofits doing like local radio station building and, local internet access and stuff like that. Just because I think it's important to get people access to communications technology, even if it's not super high tech. Like radio is still really important for a lot of people. And then I went into more national level policy stuff at some nonprofits. But around that time, I started to get frustrated. We were doing all of our campaign organizing on Facebook. And essentially, what you choose to campaign on is driven by the nonprofit funding cycle, by what seems politically feasible, and less so by maybe what might be the highest leverage systemically. And in college, one of the books that I liked the most, that I would say probably has the biggest impact on my thinking here, is this book called Thinking in Systems. And so this is a book that just compares biological systems, technical systems, social systems, and describes them by these abstract properties like centralization, decentralization, like flows of information. And I just found this a very useful and interesting way to look at the world. Maybe a bit too abstract for immediate application, I thought back then. One of my advisors at university advised me, like, no, you don't want a career as a systems theorist. You'll just be an academic. Like, there's no concrete application. But kind of coming around full circle, now I'm doing a lot of thinking in systems.
The last 10 years have been a really interesting kind of time where there's been the mainstreaming of a new, like a highly controlled type of social media system, Facebook and Twitter and others, while at the same time there's been all of this innovation in decentralized systems, largely starting with Bitcoin, or let's say inspired by things like Bitcoin, but other kinds of federated systems. And I can't think of a better time in history to be someone like systems minded working in technology, because so many of the things are happening at once and there's so much surface area to kind of play with them.
Yeah. I mean, every system has trade-offs and every action has a reaction. So I think when we started getting internet systems like, websites that started to be increasingly centralized, it starts to produce discontent at the edges because one system can't serve everybody's needs. And then that builds up over time. And then people start to invent new kinds of systems that redistribute power and maybe try to go away from complete centralization to complete peer-to-peer horizontal decentralization. And we've seen that in Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. We've seen that in Secure Scuttlebutt and some of the peer-to-peer social networks that preceded Bluesky and other networks. And those are attempts to sort of correct and change the way things work. But it's always a question of, does it meet the market need? Do people actually want to use this? Is this the kind of governance that we're going to be happy with long term? And from the long, view of history, sometimes, studying, the history of science, you look at how the printing press shook out, and it took hundreds of years to get to a place where we now live in a society defined by the written word and by the technology of the printing press. But it took a while for us to figure out how to do that and what was going to help us make sense of all this new information flowing around, what kind of institutions we were going to build. And I think things are happening faster now, but we're in a similar transition period where we're figuring out what does internet, systems like, governance, even platforms look like for us long term, like what's going to work for us. And I see Bluesky as part of that experimentation, but there's been many, many other experiments because it's sort of a discovery process of society as a whole.
Right. And when it comes to trade-offs in systems like this, sometimes they are theoretical, but that's not the same as feeling them. And oftentimes we have to build things in order to get our actual experience at the places where the trade-offs become more tangible. So you kind of just have to go do it.
Totally. There's some problems you don't meet until you scale, and then you meet all the real world problems, and you can sit around and debate it in theory, but until you actually meet it in practice, it's hard to fully understand or even predict what's going to happen. So it's really building something that's where the rubber meets the road. We had this discussion early on in the life cycle of Bluesky about, what is the right way to build a new protocol? Is it sit down and figure out the specs? People have done that with other protocols in the past. Is it just build a working implementation and see what comes from that? And, I don't think that's necessarily always wrong to do the spec first approach, but I'm inclined towards the build it and test it and then see what happens when it's live in the wild approach, because I think you learn a lot from the laboratory of experience.
And so is that the approach you ended up taking at the beginning of Bluesky?
We have specs around atproto now. We have documentation, but it kind of co-evolves with the implementation. And I will say we would have built something very different if we had just done specs and no code. So the process of building an app on it, of scaling an app, has really involved a lot of dogfooding, a lot of design trade-offs. If you're familiar with cryptocurrencies, you know that a lot of cryptocurrencies wallets have this trade-off between, is it going to be stored on a centralized exchange, or is it going to be stored on my device? And am I going to have these client-side keys? Well, we have keys under the hood. They're not the same as cryptocurrency keys, but they're, cryptographically they are, but in terms of use, they aren't. Functionally, yeah. But it's the same principle underneath the hood. But we talked about doing client-side keys like on your device early on. That would let me connect to you directly over my phone. Like our phones could just talk and swap posts. But it's a lot of complexity. You have to remember your own password. If you lose it, nobody can help you with it. There's all this key management problems. If you switch devices and log in from another device, now the two don't necessarily recognize each other. Solving all of these problems was at least a year of work. And we decided that it was more important to just get something out there. And most users weren't going to care about having that sort of super, give me all the control, but let me manage complexity. That's only a small percentage of users. So the way that we design things now is you have these keys, but we store them for you. If you want to, take them with you, it's various levels of difficulty to how easy we can make it over time. But the goal is to have this sliding scale of where you want to fall as a user on the trade-off spectrum of full convenience to full control. Because the more convenient it is, usually the more centralized it is. But the more control you have, the more complex it's going to be, because you have to remember everything yourself and toggle all the settings.
You have more control, but more responsibility, really, in that world. One way of thinking about accounts or keys in Bluesky, the way you just described it, is that you own it, but we'll hold it for you. Whereas what unique from most other forms of social media, you don't actually own your account. I think one of the things that's interesting about crypto assets is that you do bring that ownership more directly by putting keys in people's hands.
But a lot of people just leave it on exchanges, which means they're not holding it.
For sure.
Because they don't want to hold it.
But the idea that you could go take it off on yourself, just the option, is really important.
We sat down and thought through what is the end goal of decentralization, as in what purpose does it serve for the user? Because everything should be delivering value. And I think sometimes technologists get a bit hung up on technology for technology's sake, which is, well, there's this beautiful ideal I have of a purely peer-to-peer system that is completely horizontal and every node communicates with every other node. But yeah, it might be complex to use, but it's so beautiful in the abstract. But then when it meets the real world, you have problems scaling. Users have problems using it. And it's hard to get the real world to bend to fit this perfect idea of a system. Instead, we tried to start from human-centered design, which is, what do people want? Why are they dissatisfied with social? What is going to make them want an open alternative? Because we think it's good that you have openness and control, but sometimes people would rather just have convenience with all of its attendant ills than like have
Simplicity.
to fuss with their keys,
Right.
And so we thought about like the key things we want out of decentralization are choice and customizability, because when developers can build, you have all these options, and you want the ability to exit if somebody does something that you don't like. So you might be happy using a service in a totally centralized way up until someday they do something that you really don't like and you want to migrate. But that threshold for you migrating has to be really, really high right now, because you have to get a new identity. You have to rebuild your social graph. You have to port all your data over, or maybe you can't port it over. So it's just starting over from scratch. But if you can port things more easily and you have this right to leave and vote with your feet, then you can move around. And so it's more like choosing jurisdictions. So the way that we describe the sort of ethos of atproto and the way we've built Bluesky is a federated republic. So you have these different services that can run on this network, and there is like some centralized governance to it, like centralized moderation to it, but you can choose other jurisdictions, both within the app by stacking other moderation services on it, or outside of the app, because you can move around, choose another service provider. Now, how easy is this to do over time? How many are there? These are questions about an evolving ecosystem, but structurally, that's the philosophy of it.
I think that is so cool. For folks who might be listening who are familiar with Bluesky, they might not be familiar with atproto. So maybe it'd be helpful to just explain what atproto is briefly.
Sure, yeah. Atproto is short for the At protocol, which is can think of it as a toolbox for building social applications. So it's a social protocol. It lets you build Bluesky. You can build other sorts of apps on it by defining your own schemas. And it's sort of a bundle of things that all work together. So there's an identity system. There's a way that we do data to make it portable. There's a way that we, do moderation and curation. That's sort of not, if you do things differently, it's not like you're completely off protocol. You might be protocol compatible with a few pieces of it rather than the whole thing. And so you don't have to adopt all the pieces of it. But if you want to build an app that works a lot like Bluesky, all the tools in the toolbox are there, like Lego building blocks that you can take apart and put together to build a new kind of social app.
I'd love to zoom in a little bit on the sort of genesis of Bluesky. Like, how did it come to be? This was incubated inside of Twitter. It didn't end up inside of Twitter. Let's just talk about how it came to be at the beginning.
Sure. So I never actually worked for Twitter. I've never actually worked for a company larger, like that. Bluesky is now the largest company I've ever worked for. And we're 22 people. So that sort of gives you a sense of my career history. But what I was doing at the time was I was a decentralized social researcher. And I heard about Bluesky when Jack announced it on Twitter. And so Jack and Twitter had come up with this independently. They had been inspired by Mike Masnick, a tech reporter who had written a paper called Protocols, Not Platforms. And it was essentially advocating for a protocol-based approach to social networks to resolve some of the issues around, the debate around speech, around moderation, around algorithms and curation. And Jack got inspired by this and said, Twitter should have originally been a protocol. Let's make it a protocol now. And so he tweeted that we're going to fund this team to build a protocol, and then Twitter's going to run on it. This was late 2019. At the time, I had been working on researching and tinkering and building decentralized social protocols for a few years. In 2018, I prototyped something that is roughly shaped like the app protocol. It's the sort of foundation of the data structure I was playing around with back then. But I just realized I needed market adoption and product market fit. So I started building something similar to Facebook events as a Facebook events alternative to get whole social clusters to migrate at once, because it's really about bringing your community. We're not individuals on social, we're communities. And so I was trying to get that off the ground. And then when I heard that announcement, I had been talking to a co-founder about joining forces. He was also building an events app. And we were, just saying, maybe we should raise money, maybe we should take this somewhere. When I heard that, I was like, oh no, I've got to get involved. This is the complete summation of like everything I wanted to do, which was just build the protocol and take it to a company willing to adopt it. And then, it's like I saw it as a fast track towards mainstream adoption. So I got involved as an external researcher. I met Parag at a speech at the Internet Archive I gave because I was talking about this overview of decentralized social protocols, and we chatted afterwards. And then he put me in this Matrix chat room. So Matrix is another decentralized protocol that does Discord style chats. And Bluesky for about a year and a half was just this matrix chat room with a dozen people. And then we expanded it to about 60 people, and we self-organized a bit and, took on some research projects. I led an ecosystem review where I surveyed everyone in the space and compared point by point all these different social protocols that had been trying to do something along the spectrum of federated to decentralized. But during 2020, as you call it, the pandemic hit. And so not much progress happened on Bluesky during that time, nor on my events app. And so basically, I just kept reading and researching and doing this ecosystem review. And so we published that sometime in 2021. And then Twitter said, okay, we're actually going to do Bluesky now. Let's have a call for proposals. So anyone who has an idea for how we're going to do Bluesky, write up a detailed proposal, and then we'll pick proposals and interview folks. And at that point, I think some people had given up on Twitter actually doing this. But, late 2019 announcement of the project, 2021, they started to get moving on stuff. And I helped several other people write proposals as well, actually, because I just wanted this to happen. I was like, look, this is a moment for decentralized social. If Twitter never does this, I don't think any other big companies are going to try it. Right. This is the moment, right? So I tried to get other people to, submit proposals too. I don't know how many proposals they had, like several dozen. And then they started interviewing folks. So they interviewed me, they interviewed other people, eventually chose me to lead the project. And in my proposal, I had, drawn out how Bluesky was going to work. We've actually built something just very similar to what I originally proposed. And I went ahead and said, I think we need independence, because if we do this within Twitter, I had seen how slow that they were moving and how Jack was our biggest champion. And there were other folks at the org, like Parag was warm to this as well. But, Jack was the person who really had the vision of like, this needs to happen. And I wasn't sure, like they committed to this project over 5 years, but I wasn't sure what would happen in 5 years. It's a long time in social.
Yep.
Jack could leave, something could happen. So I decided, we really need independence. So then after I got nominated lead, I was still outside the org, and they said, well, you could join Twitter and, be a subsidiary, like much like Birdwash was a team that was independent within Twitter, and they built out community notes like pretty autonomously. So we could have gone that route. I thought about it, talked to some Birdwatch folks, but then I thought, we really need neutrality for this, that I can go talk to other organizations, not just be a Twitter, subsidiary. And I really need to have the ability to move fast, do things my own way, hire my own people, like really without all this process, and be able to just go for it in a way that's independent of all of old Twitter's like baggage and process. So I spent 6 months negotiating for independence, finally got that.
Wow.
And then we were essentially contractors commissioned to build out the app protocol for Twitter. So we were still working closely with Twitter. I had weekly calls. I talked to all sorts of people in the org. But then very quickly, things did change because Jack left, Parag took over, Elon made a bid to buy Twitter. There was a long period where we didn't know if he was going to buy Twitter or not, but it kind of froze things up within Twitter. And then when he finally did, we just saw the news like everyone else, because being outside of Twitter, we didn't even get internal bulletins. We just watched the news. And essentially, the week before Elon actually bought Twitter, we just had the sense that something was going to happen. The deal was probably going to go through. And we were like, we've got to put out an app, or like at least let people know that this is still going to keep going, that it's going to be a thing. So we just threw up a landing page and said, hey, we're going to build an app on the app protocol. It's called Bluesky, same name as the project. Check it out if you want. And we just got, hundreds of thousands of people signing up immediately. So we're like, all right, we got to launch this app. And so that was the origin of the Bluesky app, essentially. We built the app protocol first. We were, all in on this plan to be the protocol that Twitter used and work through the institutional chain of, Twitter sign-offs. And then everything just got thrown up in the air.
Well, it's amazing that you had the intuition back then that building it inside of Twitter had the potential to be a problematic setup, because you could lose support and all these other things. And then, of course, you were right. And at the same time, launching it outside of Twitter, and to an extent having the market see it as an alternative to Twitter at a crucial moment in time was probably the best thing that ever happened to the project.
Yeah, these things are just super hard to predict. I think the one thing really motivating that decision for me was just wariness about the nature of centralization, because one thing that's kind of a catchphrase I say is that the captain can always sink the ship, and like the captain can steer it in a good direction too. Like centralization is efficient for going one direction very
Right.
quickly. But also someone can just take it and like swing it into an iceberg or say, all right, we're going this way now. And then everything changes. And 5 years is, a lot has come and gone in social in 5 years in the past. And I predicted that would continue in the future. And then, if things changed, then there was no guarantee that something like Bluesky would continue to survive, continue to have support. And if things drastically changed, we needed to have our own independence and be a smaller, more agile, more independent organization can adapt quicker to changes than one tied to the fate of a large org.
There have been other attempts at capturing social network refugees, for lack of a better, people who are leaving a network because they don't like it, have tried to go different places, right? I think Mastodon probably is the most recent example of that, but there have been others before, and most of them haven't really worked. It feels to me like you managed to do something in the design of Bluesky that is very differentiated from many of the prior attempts at making it possible for people to like migrate out of a social media environment into another one.
Yeah, that was one of our goals, was to let people migrate and keep their identity and their social graph, their data too. But I think identity and relationships are the most important part of your social life online. And if you want to be able to start over easily, you have to be able to move those. And I'd used Mastodon since 2017 because I'd used almost every decentralized social alternative.
Right, sure. Yeah.
And that was one aspect that frustrated me a bit. It was also the lack of global visibility into stuff. Like they don't really have a good global feed or a good global search. And also the lack of custom algorithms or just, a good algorithm in general. Like a lot of people reacted against the over optimization of algorithms towards engagement farming by saying, no algorithm, algorithm's bad. Like we're just going to do chronological.
Right.
But I think of algorithms as maybe the kind that we use on social is like high fructose corn syrup, but you can have healthy algorithms and they're still fun if you have people design their own and you just have an open marketplace of them. Then it's sort of the farmer's marketplace of algorithms where you can choose between all these varieties of, what works for you, as opposed to just no algorithms, which works for some people, but is a little bit like going from high fructose corn syrup to just eating veggies.
I'm really glad you mentioned the marketplace of middleware, let's call it, in the Bluesky stack, because that's the other design feature that has always stood out to me. So you can, there are two marketplaces really. There's a feed marketplace and there's a moderation marketplace. And so if you think of the way that content is served to you in a feed, and then the way that you're basically protected or not protected from a moderation perspective, those are really meaningful variables in how a social network operates and feels to you. And I know that having those two things as driven by user choice were core ideas about app protocol and Bluesky from the beginning also.
Yeah, because I like to try to reduce things down to their essentials. And I think social networks are essentially who you connect with and what you see. And who you connect with is your identity and your social graph. What you see is curation and moderation. And essentially, both curation and moderation are two sides of the same coin, which is how are you controlling the way information flows through this vast network of information up to you? And curation surfaces stuff out of the vast stream of posts going by, and moderation hides stuff or blocks it from you or prevents interaction, and maybe sometimes gets it off the service entirely. So that's like filtering up and filtering down. And if you can customize these filters, you have a lot more control. And life is short. Every human only has 24 hours in a day. And our attention is a limited resource, particularly the more that information grows, the more and more information there is in the world. Ways to curate information, to summarize it, become more and more important. And so if you can open up the interfaces for curating information to more parties to innovate on rather than one company, I think you get a lot more useful experimentation, because what's happening around how information is curated is, I think, very core to a lot of debates around both AI and social networks now, because the algorithms that surface stuff to us in feeds, the way that AI summary is replacing search, these are all changing how we see the world, because what we see of the world is the information that's presented to us. And that can be very different depending on what kind of algorithm you're using or what kind of search you're using.
Getting back to the beginning of the conversation about theory versus practice, all of these ideas were in the theory of app protocol and Bluesky from the beginning, and then you built them out into the first product. And even with the changes at Twitter and Bluesky launching independently, it still took a while to build up the audience on Bluesky. And I'd love to hear more about that time period, before all the recent growth in traffic. A couple of years went by of being out in the wild, but still being small and starting to get a little bit of a sense of who's using this and why and where are they and what appeals to them. And I'd love to hear your take on what that time period was like.
Yeah, so we first got this very basic MVP of the app out in early 2023. And it was so basic that we didn't even have images. So we were like, well, let's see the 200 users that are on here right now, if they'll use it without images. And like, we plan to add images, but one thing at a time. And at the time when we were thinking about who's going to use this, we were like, well, probably people very comfortable with a text-based medium, like hyper-literate folks who are like, sure, I'll just do text-based posts. And even with image support, it wasn't going to be like Instagram levels of image support. So we added images, but some of our friends and early adopters did use it for a while without any pictures, which was amazing. And then we started getting some other folks on, and there was a wait list that we had from that website we'd thrown up. And when we first brought on some people from there, one of the people who came on in the first few batches was a TechCrunch reporter, and she wrote an article about Bluesky. And then suddenly we got all this interest. And actually, one of the first groups that joined was a lot of Brazilian users. And so for a few weeks, everything was Brazilian and Portuguese. And this was right when like images were a brand new thing, and everything was very much evolving as it was growing. So it felt a little bit like building a plane as it was starting to fall through the air and have to get wings on it before it hits the ground. And then it sort of kicked off this cycle of like each weekend, essentially, we'd have a new cluster join from Twitter. And then people, starting to talk about this thing, but it was invite only at the time. We couldn't open it up without really changing how we were thinking about scaling because of the amount of press and attention suddenly on it. If we opened up, we would have gotten a lot of downloads, which would have been great on one hand. On the other hand, we weren't fully done with federation. And so we would have had to scale up in a more centralized way. So we actually made the call to hold off on opening up, except going through invites in a sort of mediated way up until we'd been able to build out everything else. And so what we built out in that time was the ability to bring your own domain name as a handle, the ability to have the custom feeds, the algorithmic marketplace, the ability to choose your own moderation service, and then the ability to federate. So move your data off onto your own service and have all these services talk. And then, all those choices of like fulfilling that original vision and scaling up in a way that allowed other entities to run services rather than just, scaling up on AWS in a very centralized way took some time. So ultimately we ended up opening to the public February 2024. And so, about 8 months or so. And when we did that, we got another big growth wave, a lot of folks coming on. And it's essentially just grown in successive waves since then, because once we're open, whenever there's a lot of people who want to come over at once, we aren't doing the throttling that we did during the invite system.
Right. And then I guess I think the next really big inflection point was the election. Correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe the summer leading up to the election. But there was a major inflection that happened in the fall.
Yeah, there were several growth waves before the election because there's been a lot of rapid product changes at Twitter. And like I said, when you're centralized, you can move really quickly, go this direction or that direction. But if you go a radically new direction, there's probably a lot of users who are used to the old way of doing things who won't like the new direction. And so they want, no, I like the way Twitter used to work, essentially. And so then they look for alternatives.
I see.
So that happened around stuff like blocks being removed. That like, early on it was stuff like Substack links being banned or deprioritized. Like changes like this mean that people seek out alternatives that suit them better. Like we had a lot of Substack writers come on when that happened. We had a lot of people who were like, no, the way blocks work are essential to how I want to use social. So I'm going to find an alternative if you change this. And, I think that's just an example of competition actually being healthy for a social marketplace, because if you have more than one version of doing things, different users can find different things that meet their needs better. And then around the election, it was about a week after the election, actually, we started to get a lot of people migrating at once. And I tend to think about these things as things hitting a preference cascade. So discontents accrue, like maybe you didn't like the blocking thing, maybe you didn't like the links thing, but you were dealing with it up until something happens and you're like, okay, well, maybe I'm ready to move because suddenly everyone else is moving and you're looking for a new
Right.
shelling point, like a new place to go. And you want to go with the people you already know. And if everyone's moving at once, there's a better chance that you'll land in the same community that you want to be in. But if you're trying to move on
Right.
your own, it's a little bit harder.
As more people go, I guess it's easier for more people to go.
Exactly.
And that's a really interesting
Yeah.
dynamic. And that sort of happened in waves and has picked up, I think, substantially in the last quarter or so.
Yeah. And we try to think about things in terms of communities rather than just individuals. Like you are an individual using
Yep.
social, and if you're just using it to browse and get your news, it might be very solo player mode. But when you're talking to folks and building relationships, it's very much a community-based product. And when you want to move somewhere else, you want your whole community to come. So we built something called starter packs that let you bring your whole community at once. And all you need is one person in that community who says, all right, I'm going to make a list of all the accounts of scientists who have come over, and then, I'll share it with my science friends, and then they can come in, hop into a customized onboarding I've designed for them, and then we'll all be in the same place again. And so empowering individuals who want to do something for their community and then build out the tooling for them is sort of our philosophy around product design. Like build the interfaces for a motivated person to say, I'm going to build moderation for my community. I'm going to build onboarding for my community. I'm going to build a feed for my community. And then they can create something that works for them and people like them because they understand their own needs better than we do. Like if we try to sit there and create a customized onboarding for folks, we can only get so far, even with machine learning trying to predict what posts you're going to like. It's a lot better sometimes when you can just say, look, the person who is a scientist is going to understand what science accounts you're going to like more than we are.
So now here we are, it's 2025. I think Bluesky has gone from being a research project to a proof of concept to, I'd say now like a scaled player in this space. I think if something like 30 million users now, I think Twitter, I don't know how many Twitter has, maybe 300 or 400 million or, something like an order of magnitude smaller than Twitter, give or take. So point is it's big. And one of the ideas that I always like to get into on the Slow Hunch podcast is the idea of the adjacent possible and the things that are possible because they're possible right now, because of the tools we have, because of the moment in time that we're at. It's hard to skip steps, right? But you can open the door into the next room, and then once you get into that room, you can open the door into the next room. And so, kind of looking ahead a little bit from today, I'm curious what you see as the adjacent possible. Is it just more of the types of community driven growth that you've been experiencing, or do you feel like there are other primitives, technological or forces that might be technological or societal or otherwise that you feel might lead to another door opening or another kind of door opening in the near term?
I love that framework of the adjacent possible. That's similar to how I think about things too, which is the possibility space in front of us, which is changing at every point in time because everything you do opens up some possibilities and closes others. But the goal, if you want to move in a direction, is open up more possibilities related to that direction. And so what we've tried to do with building social protocol that's open and has all these choices and all this composability that's possible, and by telling the story and getting people on and showing it works, is to show people that, first of all, this is possible. Just as I was inspired years ago by Diaspora, which didn't become the social network that replaced everything, but it did inspire a lot of stuff that built on top, or like took those ideas and built separate stuff that was inspired by it. I think that we're trying to do some of that story building and showing people what exists out here. And the way that we're trying to do it is to show people that there's actually can be this analogous transition from social, where we are right now, to how the early internet worked. So early on, you had AOL, which was this very centralized walled garden way of using the internet. And they curated everything. Everything was in one place. They gave you AOL CDs to get you on. But this was eventually replaced by this open browser model over HTTP, where you just had this flexible protocol. Anyone could build a website. And then you had the browser essentially as this universal client that could access all sorts of different websites. And our goal at the very high level is to make social more like the web. So we try to borrow web design principles, web protocols wherever possible, That's why you can bring your own domain name as your username. We didn't invent a naming system outside of that because we wanted to build on the openness of the early web, and not in a completely nostalgic, like, oh, we just have to go back to blogs and RSS kind of way, but we want to be inspired by blogs and RSS and evolve it for a new way of doing social that takes into account stuff like follows and likes and moderation and curation and all these complexities of new social networks, and kind of unbundles what got packaged together into monolithic social apps and lets creativity and innovation happen again. So my view on what the possibilities are here is social becoming something more like the web again. And so you have, this universe of all sorts of apps being built, of all sorts of sites being thrown up, of people self-hosting, just like people can self-host their own website. But not everyone puts their own website up. A lot of people use stuff like WordPress or Zanga, and then we moved on to the centralized social platforms, but now we might be moving off them and opening up creativity and innovation again. And in that transition, I see us as sort of stewards of that sort of whole idea, and trying to put something into practice that demonstrates it, but also knowing that we won't get everything right on a first pass. And so here's all the pieces. We're kind of laying out our process really transparently. It's all on GitHub. It's all in, the design discussions and GitHub discussions. And you can go in and look at it and see if this meets your needs. And if not, build something slightly different or contribute to the discussion. And what I try to tell people is that this will work if everybody gets involved and starts building it, because social is something that's very integral to how society works, but you have to get society involved. And for a long time now, we've started to feel disempowered by our own social networks. So it's like, well, the only way to make change is to lobby the company or lobby the government. And as users, we don't have much choice. Maybe I can use a new app, but that's it. But now we're trying to tell people, hey, the app is open source. You can submit a pull request if you are a developer. You can, try a different app if you're a user. And like, there's a lot of other apps out there that have made different design choices. And if you want to get involved, even as like a civil society org or something, the way we've tried to design the moderation and curation interfaces are, if you're an academic and you're studying algorithms that reduce polarization rather than, drive people towards more extreme opinions, you can do that right on Bluesky in the App Protocol network right now. And people are starting to pick that up. If you're, a nonprofit or like a civil society group wanting to build moderation that works better for kids or for your local community, you can go ahead and just do that and like experiment with, adding something into the system that plugs either directly into the Bluesky app or, builds a new app that has your preferences encoded.
One way that I've been thinking about this is that it's extensible in a lot of different directions, right? The feed, the moderation, the infrastructure, but also the applications and the clients themselves, right? So somebody could build something that looks like TikTok on top of the app protocol that connects into the same social graph, or something that looks like Instagram, or something that looks like a game platform, or something that looks totally different, benefiting from the connected identity and content system, but totally open to build, or to just build a better Bluesky app that they like better. And at the same time, it's transparent on the way in, right? So people can look into the system and see all the content, see all the sort of dynamics, and learn from it. And so both of those are opportunities for the community to keep building the network.
Sometimes it's almost confusing how many directions it can be extended, and it's more or less hard depending on how close you are to the experiences we've designed for you. So within the app, you can install a different feed, and you can go to a different feed builder and like build a no-code feed. That's all possible without having to know how to code. If you want to build your own app, you have to know how to code. If you want to build a whole new service, people are building TikTok style, Instagram style apps. You have to be a developer to do that, but it is possible. And, it's just showing people the spectrum of possibility. Like you can go from just click over here and install a different feed to build a whole new app and, roll your own, feed system, your own moderation system, and experiment. And of course, it's going to take more technical know-how and more resources to do the more dramatically different things. But having it be possible, I think, is really important, because there's always appetite for people to modify social because it's fun, it's important, it's how we get our information. People want to experiment in this realm, and we want to keep that openness to experimentation as something that shows people this is probably the way social should evolve. This gives people the ability to take things all sorts of different directions. And going back to the systems thinking about this, centralization is good for going one direction quickly with concentrating all your resources, but decentralization lets you explore a lot of different possibilities in parallel. And maybe some of these experiments won't go anywhere. Others might be very successful. And you get to explore them all at once with different people picking up different aspects of it. And in a period of change where you're not really sure what the right next step is or the right next direction is, that's a good way to explore the adjacent possible, is just have an open system where, you're not the one saying, all right, with all these 10 possibilities, I can only commit to one. So I'll do this one, but then other people can pick up, other 8 more and try them out. And then we'll see what shakes out from that. And I think in a period where you want to design, new institutions, new ways of going about gathering information online, having this experimentation from the very simple for a user or an academic who doesn't know how to code is able to use to the very complex and fully featured that a developer can do, that's an important way to open up the creativity of people to evolve the social networks we use every day.
Wow. That is amazing. You want to design systems to be open and buildable and enable experimentation. And to your point, especially in times where there's a lot of uncertainty in the world. Well, listen, I know you're busy making all of this happen, not just talking about it. Thank you for coming in and having this conversation. This is so interesting, and really, I just really appreciate you taking time out of your day to come talk about it, and really wish you the best in seeing this all through going forward.
Thank you. This is fun. I love being able to talk about the whole history of everything and the broader philosophy, which I hope shows up in the product, but I try not to, make everything a long philosophical blog post.
I think that's probably the right choice in the day-to-day, and also why I'm so happy we could take a few moments today to kind of dig into the other parts. So
thank you.
Thank you again, Jay. Really appreciate it, and I'll talk to you soon.